Story 1. I was not a tester, but there was a license center next to the sporting goods store where I worked. A lot of people would practice there in the straight-in parking spots before their driving test. A young woman who only had a permit mixed up the gas and brake and drove right through the front of the license center. I was told later she was even more upset when they would not let her reschedule her test for the following day, because they canceled the test she had been pulling in to take when she wrecked the front of the building. Not long after, they installed a row of bollards in front to protect the building. I was amazed at how marked up they became in the first few months. Story 2. My driver's education teacher said that one student reclined his seat all the way back, put one foot on the gas and the other on the brake, grabbed the top of the steering wheel with one hand, and said, "Let's go." Story 3. I am not a tester, but I heard about a girl in driver education who was driving on the interstate with the instructor and 3 other students. The instructor said they had missed the exit but would just get off at the next one. I am not sure what the girl's thought process was, but she pulled into the grass and tried to drive against oncoming traffic to return to the missed exit. The instructor had to apply the passenger side brake while the 3 other students screamed bloody murder. Story 4. When I went to take my driving test, the tester waited until I was at an intersection and then yelled, "Turn left." She scared me, so I turned and failed. When I went back to try again, she was berating a girl and her mother in the parking lot. I thought I would get a different tester because she was clearly busy. Story 5. When I was taking my driving test, I asked the examiner how many tests he administered in a normal day. He said, 10. Not all that surprising until he added, 10 and 8 will fail before making it out of the car park. He explained that the vast majority of failures are for administrative reasons, such as arriving late, not bringing a learner's license, or having a vehicle that is not road legal. The latter was more common than it sounds. All lights, turn signals, and the horn are tested in the car park before the test itself begins. Fail any of the above and you have wasted $75 and never even got into gear. Story 6. I asked the driving examiner during my driver's license test what the worst thing an applicant had done was. Apparently, an older gentleman drove through 3 stop signs before the examiner told him to pull over. He explained that he did not want the license, but his family had pressured him. So he deliberately ran the stop signs to fail after making sure no cars were coming. Story 7. While I was waiting for my turn to take my commercial driver's license test, I watched a man in a semi-truck back into a light pole. Instead of stopping to see what he had hit, he accelerated and knocked it over. I did not get to take my test for about an hour while they cleaned it up. Story 8. The children make minor mistakes, and yes, some make scary mistakes. However, the adults scare me most, especially the seniors taking re-examinations. The worst test I ever conducted involved a man in his 90s. I instructed him to turn onto a street when it was safe to do so, and he turned, narrowly missing a pedestrian. He was driving on the wrong side of the road and came head-to-head with another car, which pulled over to let him pass. He was laughing because he believed it was a one-way road. When I returned to the office, having cut the test short and taken him back in the quickest and safest way possible, he was astounded when I told him it was not a one-way street. Me. Did you see any one-way signs? Him. No, but I assumed you would take me on one. Story 9. My best friend was approaching a 4-way stop sign in our small rural town. The tester told her to go straight, so she did without stopping at the sign, driving right through without batting an eye. He told her, "You failed. If you want, just drive back." Story 10. Last year, I was making a left turn at a light when a car swerved into my lane and hit me. It turned out the person was taking a driver's test. I am not sure how car insurance works for someone taking a driving test, but the instructor told me we had to wait for the police and exchange details. I guess the driver did not pass. Story 11. I went forward instead of reversing when the tester was standing on the curb in front of me. I failed the test. Story 12. One of my classmates in high school failed his driver's test 6 times. During one test, he hit a pedestrian. Story 13. Opposite kind of story here. When I was taking driver's education, I was in a car that had a brake on the passenger side for the instructor to use, just in case. I was going 35 miles per hour down a fairly busy street when my car suddenly came to a complete stop. In horror, I looked over at my instructor, who was sound asleep with his foot on the brake. I sat there dumbfounded. After a couple of people honked, he shook himself awake, mumbled the word accelerate, and sat up, adjusting his glasses. I passed the test. The instructor was in his 70s and did not seem to care about anything. Story 14. My grandfather used to be a tester. Once, a girl with him forgot which way to turn the steering wheel and they ended up in a ditch. Story 15. I should have technically failed my test because when I turned across the oncoming lane a car was reasonably close. When we returned to the registry the tester said she could have failed me. But it was raining, there were low dark clouds, and a black car without its lights was coming over the crest of a hill, so she gave me the benefit of the doubt. That afternoon I went for my first solo drive. As I was pulling into a shopping mall, I completely missed a pedestrian crossing sign and nearly ran someone down. I slammed on the brakes at the last second and apologized profusely, but she just stared at me. It was the woman who had done my test. She shook her head and walked off. Thanks for the benefit of the doubt, though. Story 16. My dad was friends with a man who worked at the motor vehicle registry and administered road tests. His best story was about a kid who took his test while it was raining. The kid started driving with the windshield wipers off. The examiner thought he was nervous and tried to give him a break by saying it was raining pretty hard. The kid, white-knuckled on the steering wheel, just said, "Yeah." Again trying to help, the examiner asked if he thought he should do something about that. The kid said, "Yeah." Apparently he did not know where the wiper controls were. So he rolled down the driver's side window and stuck his head out. At that point, the examiner stopped the test and failed him. Story 17. I took a test with a girl who drove on the wrong side of the road and made a left turn into oncoming traffic, all in the same drive. The test was administered by my school, and she was banned from taking it there because of that. Story 18. Kind of the opposite of your question. It was actually the worst thing a tester could do. He got into the car, a small hatchback. He was a huge man and could not fit. He said he would fail me unless I could get a car he could fit into within 15 minutes. Otherwise my slot would be gone and I would have to rebook and pay again. Luckily my father was 5 minutes away and brought his sedan. Disaster averted, or so I thought. He asked me to do a U-turn on a farm road with a single lane each way and a ditch on either side. It was impossible given the car's turning circle. I attempted the largest angle possible, but because of the ditches it ended up being a 3-point turn. He asked if I was deaf and if I knew what a U-turn was. I politely tried to explain it was not possible, which I am sure he knew. I completed the test and passed everything else. He failed me and told me to come back when I learned to drive. I rebooked the next day and passed with a different examiner. This happened in 2005. 15 years later, he was in the news and sentenced to jail for accepting bribes. In hindsight, his earlier comment about some sort of reparation for not fitting in the car makes sense now. Story 19. In my local area, a man in his mid-20s failed the test. At the time, the results were shared in the car. After being told he had failed, he got out and took an axe from the trunk. I do not know further details, but apparently that is why results are now shared inside the licensing building rather than in cars. Story 23 stories. My ex drove a geo-tracker, a tiny car. She pulled into the parallel parking area and fit in unbelievably easily. The tester made her do it properly. A girl in my driver's education class failed her test at the Department of Motor Vehicles because she turned into oncoming traffic. There was a grass median with skinny red and white poles for about 10 feet, followed by a guardrail. Each side of the median had 3 lanes. There was no way to miss it, but she did. On a lighter note, I did the 100-foot backup when the tester told me to. I stopped and, before I put the car into park, he asked me a few verbal questions and then told me to leave the area and return to the parking lot for the parallel parking test. I never shifted into drive. When I pressed the gas, the car shot backward about 20 feet. He apologized and said it was his fault for distracting me and that, as far as he was concerned, it never happened. Story 21. It was not a child. It was my 80-year-old great-aunt. The tester kept telling her to speed up. After a few attempts she said she could not see the speedometer, so she did not know how fast she was going. He made her pull over and she did not receive a license renewal. Thank goodness. Life pro tip: drive extra carefully around pharmacies. They are often crowded with older adults, and pharmacies are one of the few places many of them still need to drive to. Story 22. When I parallel parked, I hit the pole behind me. The tester said it was fine and that it should have been an automatic fail, but they thought that would be too harsh. Later, I hit the pole in front of me head-on and did not pass. Story 23. My old driving instructor told me about a kid who pulled into the drive-thru at McDonald's, ordered some food, then realized he had left his wallet in his other car. He had been using the instructor's car and asked the instructor to pay, offering half of his fries in return. The wallet also contained his license, so the instructor failed him on the spot and told him to get out of the car. Story 24. My dad did driver's testing for a few years, and once a girl stopped on railroad tracks. A train was approaching slowly. It takes a long time to stop, and it blasted its horn right at the passenger side with the window open. This made her freeze up even more. He had to reach his foot across to her side to hit the accelerator. In Canada, you can take your driver's test in any car you choose because, in theory, you should be good enough to drive without an instructional car. So this car did not have dual pedals. Story 25. Not a tester, but I watched my at the time know-it-all son do the California roll through 3 consecutive stop signs as he was exiting the courthouse parking lot at the beginning of the test. The tester stopped the test and failed him on the spot before he even got out of the parking lot. My son's excuse was that he thought the test had not started yet. Story 26. My father used to tell stories about when his dad worked at the Massachusetts Registry. One story, I'll change names for privacy, was about a kid taking a test who was awful but very stuck up. Somehow the kid had my grandfather's name, so after he tried to act slick and pull strings and said, "I know Chuck Lafitte," my grandfather, who was giving the test, replied, "Oh really? You know Chuck Lafitte?" The kid said, "Yep. No you don't, because I'm Chuck Lafitte." The kid did not get a license that day. Edit. I heard these stories a long time ago. They were told often, so I don't remember the details well. Thinking about it, the kid may even have claimed to be related to Chuck Lafitte, which would have been even more foolish. Story 27. This reminded me of a moment during my final test. The tester had an arm injury and was wearing a brace on his right arm. I took a left turn way too sharply and caused him to accidentally hit his arm against the door. I exclaimed, "Oh, I'm so sorry." Surprisingly, he passed me that day. Maybe he did not want me to come back. Laughing out loud. Story 28. I was the kid. Full transparency. It was a learning drive, not the test. We had to complete 6 scheduled drives with our instructor, and we had a partner. One person would drive for 30 minutes, then stop and switch so the other could drive back. The rule when you got in the car, so it would not be a constant game of whether to turn, was that you always went straight until the instructor told you to turn. One Saturday we had a very early drive scheduled. We met at the school and I was first to drive. About 5 minutes in we turned onto a main road, and the instructor quickly fell asleep. My partner and I smirked and agreed that we would still follow the rules. We stayed on the road for about an hour and 15 minutes, until it dead-ended and required a turn. I pulled into a parking lot and we woke the instructor to ask which way to turn. It took about 30 seconds for him to realize what had happened and where we were. He yelled at us both to get into the back seat, and we witnessed some very unsafe driving as we headed back to the school. I did not bat an eye. Story 29. During a commercial driver's license test, I sat in the sleeper berth. The applicant ground the gears when shifting and immediately let go of the steering wheel, forcing the exam proctor to grab the wheel and drive for about 5 seconds while the applicant recomposed himself. Story 30. I have a story from when I was a beginner driver. My mom used to take me out to practice driving. I had my license but was still inexperienced. At a particular intersection, my mom saw someone cross against a red light. Looking at them, she said sarcastically, "Sure. This red signal doesn't apply. Let's just drive on." Too focused on driving to notice her tone or interpret it as anything other than an instruction, I did exactly that. I drove straight through the red light. It was fortunate that it was nighttime and there was almost no traffic, but it felt eerie afterward. Story 31. As someone who worked at the Department of Motor Vehicles for many years issuing driver's licenses, I think I'm the closest thing to your target respondent so far. The craziest thing I ever witnessed was a man who somehow managed to lose control at less than 15 miles per hour, jumped the curb and smashed into the guardrail. Needless to say, he was not issued a driver's license. The best story I heard from a coworker happened right after she came inside swearing, because during the part of the test when the examiner stands on the curb to observe maneuvers, her applicant drove up over the curb and straight into her knee. Story 32. I was not the tester. I was in the back seat of the car when it happened. I had just taken my third and final driving test and passed it without a hitch. The driving route was to another kid's house to pick her up. As I pulled into the driveway, the driving instructor said, "Just be ready." She has never even sat in a driver's seat of a car before. I did not think much of it because my first time driving had been with the instructor and it had gone well. We got in and started driving. Not even 45 seconds later, we reached a stop sign. She did not stop, so the instructor slammed on his brake with his foot in the footwell. She was confused and continued to press the accelerator harder, all the way to the floor. After a lot of screaming telling her to stop, she put the car in park and blew the transmission. It was an early 1980s Volvo and the car was essentially junk. It was funny because as we were driving, my instructor had been saying how surprised he was the car was still running. It had about 295,000 miles on it. Story 33. At the Department of Motor Vehicles renewing my driver's license, I listened to the tester explain to the parents why the applicant failed. She sped immediately after leaving the lot and drove through a school zone at high speed. Story 34. I am a driver's license tester. It is one of many roles at my job. We test on a course, so there is not much room for major mistakes. I go over everything before the exam to refresh candidates' memories because they get nervous. I walk through the whole test, but the second we go outside it all disappears. I had one candidate back into another car while leaving the spot to start the test. He did not understand why he failed because the other car was not on the course. Our parking section uses cones to simulate cars. I have had candidates plow over the cones, run them over, back over them, and continue thinking they are doing well. The only people who have driven on the wrong side of the road were from other countries where that is normal. They realize it a few seconds later and have an "oh no" look. Nothing else unusual. Story 35. I heard this story from my driving instructor in high school. He was giving a student a lesson on the highway and asked the student to pass a car that was driving a little slowly. The student signaled, merged into the left lane, and gently accelerated. Everything was going well when the student suddenly exclaimed, "Oh my, I am sorry. I forgot to shift the gear and to pass." The instructor was momentarily confused until it was too late, as the student reached for the automatic gear shifter and threw it into park while traveling at 65 miles per hour. That was not good for the car. Story 36. The first time I took the driving test, I had never parallel parked before because I live in the suburbs. I tried and ended up about 3 feet from the curb. The second time, I backed into the space perfectly. The instructor said, "Okay, just pull forward a foot and you are good." Excited that I had done it, I forgot to shift into drive and reversed over the cones. The third time, it was pouring rain. I drove at the exact speed limit. Afterwards, the instructor said I had been driving too fast in the rain, but he passed me anyway. Story 37. Several happened in one day. I was not the tester. I was waiting in line to get my test with about 30 other people. 1. The car they intended to use did not have valid registration or inspection. Automatic fail. 2. The car had no brake lights. Automatic fail. 3. The insurance in the car was expired. 4. The driver put the car in reverse instead of drive and nearly backed into the car behind them. Automatic fail. 5. The driver ran over the parallel parking cone completely. Automatic fail. 6. The driver hit the curb turning left out of the lot. Automatic fail. These were 6 different people who went before me. It was beyond frustrating. I waited over an hour for 6 of the 10 people in front of me to not even leave the parking lot. Story 38. My dad is a driver education teacher. Every week when we go to lunch, he always has a story about how he almost died the previous week. Most of them involve students not knowing their left from their right, which is understandable if you have never driven before and are nervous. But he says most of the time it is students trying to multitask, changing the radio or grabbing their phone. After a few months and a couple of near misses, he makes the student driver hand him their phone and only he can touch the radio. In some of these stories, the students are not even the problem. It is other drivers. The car had 4 giant magnetic stickers that said student driver in black and yellow on the front, back, and sides of a silver Chevy Impala. Other drivers will get close and try to intimidate the students by honking, revving, or boosting the bass in their music. I have been driving for 18 years and I know that still messes with me. God knows how the students feel. In the first half of this year, he had a terrible student driver. The girl would just freeze up at random. He said this went on for 2 weeks before he had to fail her in the course. One time she popped a curb because there was a squirrel in the road. Then there was the time she almost ran a red light and plowed right into a smart car. My favorite was when she forgot which pedal was the brake and which one was the gas pedal. He said they sat in the school parking lot for 10 minutes so she could remember. Story 39. I was not an instructor. In high school, my instructor had me drive around doing his chores. I had to drive to Blockbuster to drop off his videos, to the Dunkin' Donuts drive-thru, and to look at a house he was considering buying. Story 40. I failed my first test by taking the wrong turn at a stoplight. It was not an illegal turn, and when I returned to the Department of Motor Vehicles, the tester said I had driven beautifully and would have passed with flying colors, including pulling over properly to allow an ambulance to pass, if I had not taken a wrong turn off the course. I came back the next day and passed. Story 41. I'm not a tester, but my cousin went to get their driver's license. They pulled out of the Department of Motor Vehicles parking lot, took both hands off the wheel to lower the sun visor to block the sun, and failed instantly. Story 42. A couple of friends and I were in high school when we knew a guy who was famous for failing his driver's license test repeatedly. The most notorious story was that he failed once because he fell asleep at the wheel during the test. We asked him directly. He was embarrassed but confirmed it. He dozed off for a few seconds with the Department of Motor Vehicles examiner sitting next to him. When we asked how that was possible, since most people are nervous during the test, he mumbled that he was sleepy and hurried away. We dropped it and never got a better explanation. Story 43. I am not a test administrator, but my ex-girlfriend failed her exam during parallel parking. She backed in perfectly, then sped through the front cones. Story 44. I guess I met the criteria. I was prior military and, after being certified for a long time in the United States Coast Guard as a truck and trailer driver transporting small boats to boat launch ramps, I would take new sailors out to practice towing with a trailer, working the hitch, basic maintenance, hand signals for spotters, avoiding jackknifing in reverse, and backing the boat and trailer into a garage or boat ramp. A young sailor fresh from boot camp was with me for the day while we drove down to a ramp to offload the boat and crew to work a few ranges on the water for the day. It was the sailor's final sign-off, and he was to take the empty trailer and boat back to base alone after I joined the crew on the water. He had ridden with me as a passenger successfully many times by this point, had all his sign-offs completed, and was endorsed by command to be issued his driver authorization letter. Several hours later, our boat was mooring at the base pier, and the new sailor and truck were nowhere in sight. I called him to find out where he was. Long story short, on the way home he stopped at an ice rink to fool around and parked illegally in a handicapped spot. The government vehicle was towed, but instead of calling us, he took a ride-hailing service home, turned off his phone, and hid in his barracks room. We had to get command to negotiate with the city to retrieve the truck from impound, and the auditors in government vehicle procurement were not happy. He did not receive his certification. Story 45. When I was in the Army, I had an excellent driving instructor who had seen it all and was almost old enough to retire. He told a story about practicing with a student in an armored tracked vehicle. At one point they approached a roundabout, and he instructed the student to continue straight ahead, meaning they would pass the roundabout and take the second exit. The student did exactly that. He drove straight over the roundabout. I couldn't stop laughing when I heard that story. It still brings a big smile to my face. Story 46. My cousin's dumbass sister was doing the driving portion. She jumped straight in and did not buckle her seatbelt. Automatic fail. Story 47. When I went to take my test, the Department of Motor Vehicles was across the highway from the truck stop. I made a right turn onto the highway to get on the interstate. Right after I entered the highway, a semi-truck turned left and crossed 4 lanes into my lane. My tester became silent. I saw what he was doing, so I slowed down, pulled onto the shoulder, and then into a driveway until the semi-truck passed. When it was clear, I signaled and re-entered the highway, then merged onto the interstate behind the semi-truck. My tester told me to turn around at the next exit that I had passed. Story 48. Not a tester, but at my local Department of Motor Vehicles, I was inside when an old man came to renew his license. He somehow managed to put the car in reverse, jump the curb, and smash through the front window of the office. That was a weird day. Story 49. I'm not a driver's license examiner, but when I was 16 and taking a driving course, a group of kids in my class convinced a very ditzy girl that stop signs with a white border were optional. She ran 2 stop signs during her test and had to retake the course. That must have been a pretty scary moment for the examiner. Story 50. I'm not a tester, but a tester told me about a 16-year-old. During his driving test, he had to slow down because an elderly woman was crossing the street ahead. When he pulled up next to her, he stepped on the brake, rolled down the window, and began screaming. He called her an old hag and launched into a tirade filled with profanity about her not crossing at a traffic light. He did not understand that verbally abusing elderly pedestrians during the test is unacceptable. Story 51. My uncle was a driving tester. The best story I ever heard was about a student who farted from stress while the windows were up. The smell was so bad that the student tried to roll down both windows, but he panicked and kept hitting the lock and unlock buttons. My uncle calmly rolled down a window and said, "I think we have tested the locks thoroughly." The student started crying and ran out of the car. Apparently, he soiled his pants. Story 52. The day I went to take my driver's license test, after having my license restricted for 2 years, a woman was backing out of her spot. The space behind her was empty, so she intended to back into it. She got scared, slammed on the accelerator, jumped the curb, and landed on the hood of an unsuspecting Mercedes. Story 53. My tester told me this story. A young driver was driving when a squirrel ran into the street in front of her and she freaked out. The tester told her to calm down and hit the squirrel, so she did. After the squirrel ran up onto the sidewalk and away from danger, the driver drove onto the sidewalk and hit it. Story 54. This was not the driving test, but the required 6 hours with a learner's permit and a driving instructor. I finished my hours and the instructor told me to leave the car running in park and swap seats. I got out of the car and shut the door, only to find that I had just locked both of us out while the car was running. He then had to break into the car with a coat hanger. The next day, after 2 3-hour lessons, he had me drive him to a hardware store to buy a spare key and a magnetic key box. Story 55. I am not a tester, but when I took my test for the first time, I hit a dumpster while leaving the parking lot before I even started. I was so embarrassed and disappointed in myself that I cried when I got home. My father made it worse by saying he was disappointed in me, which made me even more upset. Story 56. Original post. I am taking my test this coming Tuesday and I am very nervous, but this is making me feel better. Laughing out loud. Could always be worse. Update. Thank you to everyone for your kind words. I wish everyone who is taking the test soon good luck. I will update this after I take it tomorrow for anyone who is interested. Update 2. I passed. Thank you to everyone for your kind words. Story 57. My science teacher used to administer driving tests. He would take students to an empty road and tell them they did not have to stop at the stop sign because there was no one around. If they did not stop, he failed them. Story 58. I witnessed a woman from another country fail the parking portion of the driving exam. She barely spoke the local language. The test included 6 maneuvers, 4 of which were required. The required maneuvers were a near-perfect stop at a stop sign, parallel parking, a three-point turn, and parking in a normal parking space like those in any parking lot. The only rule was not to touch any of the objects used to mark the course, and you had 3 attempts. If you touched something, you immediately failed. This woman literally dismantled the testing area. She was given a second attempt even though the law forbade it. Her father was livid that the examiner would not let her pass and attempted to fight him. In the end, he paid for the damages and drove his daughter home. Story 59. Not exactly what you were looking for. During my driving exam years ago, I saw a car traveling at high speed cross the 2 lanes on my side at a 45-degree angle. It hopped the curb, drove over the median, cut off several cars on the other side, went into the ditch, and was launched about 3 feet into the air. I exclaimed loudly, but the tester had not seen anything. Story 60. I was the passenger during driver's education. Another student was driving. The instructor made small talk and asked how his family was doing. The student said his father had a heart attack and died the night before. He showed no visible reaction and simply completed the drive. When we returned to his house, we sat in the driveway for a minute and both began crying. It was a bizarre experience. Story 61. During my brother's driving test, he rolled through a red light without even looking at the cross traffic. When the tester asked him what he was doing, he said, without blinking, "Right turn on red." To this day, I refuse to let him live that down. Story 62. After my grandmother finished taking her test as a teenager, the examiner told her, "Well, you did everything perfectly, but every time I told you to go right, you went left, and when I told you to go left, you went right." She passed anyway. She still does not know her left and right. Story 63. Reading these stories makes me realize why there are so many bad drivers in Louisiana and why we have the highest insurance rates. To get my license, I only had to drive 25 miles per hour on a road for about 1 mile, make 2 right turns, and park normally. No parallel parking, no left turns, nothing complicated. Story 64. My first time taking my driver's exam, my instructor told me to put the car in reverse and back up as straight and as safely as possible. I was almost done with the test but very nervous, so I reversed, hit the pedal, and backed up at probably 20 miles per hour, ending up in the middle of the road. I did not pass, and my instructor looked mortified. Luckily, some practice and hitting a few bushes helped me pass a month later. Story 65. I am not a tester, but I was in the car when this happened. At the school where I learned, students drove in pairs. One student would drive an hour away, then they would switch roles and the other would drive back while the instructor offered help and advice. I had finished my part of the driving and was sitting in the back trying not to get carsick. I had done this a couple of times before with some classmates, but this drive was much bumpier than the others. We stopped at a red light and the student needed to turn left. He turned on his signal, looked both ways, and began his turn while the light was still red, with barely enough of a gap in traffic to get through. The instructor stopped him and asked what he was doing. He replied, "If you're turning right and the light is red and no one is coming, you can turn. Isn't it the same for turning left?" I'm not sure if he passed the class, but it was one of the most stressful drives of my life. Story 66. On my wife's first attempt, she did not even make it out of the parking spot. The instructors asked her about the headlights, and she replied, "Are they not automatic?" Story 67. They do not check their mirrors, use their blinkers, and think texting on the phone is not wrong. He argued about it, then his mother came and told me, the owner of a traffic school, that we had sold her something else. She berated and insulted us and said we had failed her son. We taught him everything and practiced the driving test in our vehicle about 20 times. We used to work for the Department of Motor Vehicles. The young driver failed before he even left park because he did not check his mirrors, did not fasten his seatbelt as instructed, and started texting on his phone for 24 seconds. A woman once closed her eyes on the highway and drove us into a ditch because she was afraid of fast-moving vehicles. Story 68. My foolish mistake was driving on the wrong side of the road, and I instantly failed. The test took place in a closed testing area, not on an actual street. The person in front of me was also on the wrong side, so I asked the tester if I was supposed to be there. He asked what I thought. I assumed that because it was a self-contained track, I had to follow the other car to complete the test. So embarrassing. Story 69. Story time. When I was 17, I lived in Ohio and went in for my driver's test to get my license. There, a state patrol officer rode along and administered the test. It was intimidating to have an officer ride with you. I passed with only one minor mistake. The embarrassing part happened while I was waiting for them to print my card. The office was very busy, near capacity. Not a single chair was empty. Another kid came in from his test with his head hanging low. A patrol officer followed him in with a gruff look. The officer must have been 6'5", a mountain of a man. The boy walked over to his father and explained that he had failed his test. The father lost his temper and walked over to the officer, putting his finger in the officer's face and yelling. The entire room went silent and watched. The father demanded how the officer could fail his son, insisting that turning left into a turn lane and merging into traffic was not illegal. The officer, knowing everyone was watching, told him it was illegal and that he could show where in the book it was written. He pulled out the driving laws book and showed him. Then the officer said that was not the reason he failed the son. He failed because he had been doing 45 miles per hour in a school zone. The entire room began to snicker. The father quickly grabbed his son and ran out. Story 70. I remember my driver's test clearly. I was an overly arrogant kid. I procrastinated and did not get my learner's permit until about 4 months before turning 16. That meant I could only get my license 2 months after turning 16 because you had to have a permit for 6 months in my state. Finally, I waited out the 6 months and felt like I knew what I was doing. I took the test in my dad's Cadillac DeVille, an enormous boat of a car. Part of the test was a 3-point turn. I thought I had aced it. There was also an emergency braking test, which I thought I had done well on. Then he asked me to stop at a stop sign. Near the end, I pulled into a parking spot. The tester spent a long time filling out his sheet and then said, "You passed. You can go in and get your license." Being cocky, I asked if I had done anything wrong, fully expecting praise. He said, "At the beginning of the test, you started backing out of the spot before looking. You eventually looked, but you could have run over someone standing directly behind the car. After you pulled out of the parking lot, you hit the accelerator hard and had to correct your steering to stay in the lane. You would have lost control if it had been raining. Your 3-point turn was completed but not done safely because you were not looking both ways. You pulled too far forward and too far backward, more than necessary. Your hands were on the wheel, but I was not confident you had a good grip when it mattered most. You stopped at the stop sign behind the white line, but you failed to approach slowly after moving forward. Your right turns were close to cutting the curb. Your left turns were much too early. During the emergency braking, you let go of the brake pedal and pressed it again, which increased braking distance. You basically barely passed. I hope you become a better driver." I went from cocky to feeling like I was barely cutting it. It was a total wake-up call. I worked at my driving, and at 37 I am a much better driver, partly because he pointed out the nuances I missed from inexperience. Story 71. I'm not a tester, but I always like to share the story about my great-grandfather. He took the driver's test and got his license at 14, although legally it was 16 in Kentucky. He lied to the Department of Motor Vehicles, the United States Navy, and my great-grandmother, claiming he was 2 years older than he actually was. About 70 years later, when he went to renew his license, they finally realized he had lied about his birth date on his original license. They still let him renew, but they had to change his birth date on numerous documents. Story 72. When I was waiting to take my driving test, I overheard a conversation between the instructor and the mother of the driver before me. Instructor: "Ma'am, do you know what the speed limit in Dunkirk is?" Mother: 30? Instructor: "You might want to tell your son. Have a nice day." Story 73. It was my great-grandma's funeral the day I took my driver's test. Since it takes months to get testing appointments where I live, my parents had me take the test as planned and then go straight to the funeral. I was a casket bearer, so I wore a full suit to my driver's test in the middle of July. I was hot, miserable, and thinking about the funeral. While backing up, I was so hot, uncomfortable, and distracted that I missed a cone. I tapped it with my bumper and it tipped over. I am still not sure why, but I kept trying to park and ran over the cone. The instructor asked, "What if that cone was a child?" I replied, "They would be dead." I failed. Story 74. Not the kid, but the examiner. I was taking the exam, but due to a mix-up in the system, there was no one assigned to be my examiner. No problem. There was a written exam going on, so the retired instructor in his 80s who oversaw the written exam agreed to be my examiner, and my driving instructor took the written test. He needed to be there because the test was performed in a specially equipped car with pedals on the passenger side so the instructor could intervene to avoid accidents. I was expecting an easy test. Just drive around for an hour and hope he did not die of old age. Everything went well for the first half hour, but when we reached a big road, the car kept speeding up after I took my foot off the accelerator. The accelerator was stuck. I pressed the clutch to the floor and remembered the Corey Haim and Corey Feldman instructional video license to drive, where they fixed this problem by kicking the accelerator repeatedly while calmly telling the examiner that the pedal was stuck. He quickly identified the problem. The footrest he had been using turned out to be the instructor pedals. After he removed his foot from the accelerator, the problem was solved and we were both fine. Story 75. My driver's education teacher said a student drove straight into a ditch. When he asked why she did that, she said she thought the car would steer itself. She ended up getting her license, so watch out for that one. Story 76. Is this some sort of sick joke? I literally just came back from failing my driving test, opened Reddit to cheer myself up, and this is what I see? For goodness sake. Story 77. I'm not a driving test examiner, but my boyfriend told me that he stalled an automatic transmission while pulling out of the parking lot during his driver's test. They should have failed him, but they let him pass because he was otherwise very good. And I 100% believe him because I started dating him right after he got his license, and for about 2 years he stalled the car pulling out of our driveway on every single date. Story 78. I was at the Department of Motor Vehicles in the retirement town where I lived, and I watched a very elderly woman fail the vision test completely. The tester felt sorry for her and processed her application anyway. It is worth noting that in Arizona, where this happened, a driver's license does not expire for about 50 years. Story 79. I was a kid with a terrible tester. He wasn't even supposed to be the tester. The regular person wasn't there for some reason, so I got stuck with him. He did not know the route well and told me to turn as we were passing the turn, which led to sharp, sudden turns. At the end he said I had not done poorly enough to fail, but he did not feel confident passing me. That was unfair. If I had done everything correctly, I should not have failed. I came back a week later and passed easily with the regular tester. I'm still irritated about that to this day. Story 80. My friend knocked over a mailbox and was expelled from that driving class. He did not lightly tap it. He deliberately drove off the road just enough to knock it over and then returned to the road. Story 81. I was a student. I drove on the left side of the road. I am also American. Story 82. A good friend of mine worked at the Department of Motor Vehicles for almost 50 years and administered many driving tests. I remember 2 crazy stories he told me. Story 1. An Indian couple came in and the wife was testing to get her license. They were new American citizens, so they were not totally used to the culture and there was still a bit of a language barrier. The Department of Motor Vehicles where my friend worked was also near a busy train yard. They got out on the road and the woman was doing fine. Nothing major wrong with her driving. My friend decided it was time to turn around and end the test, so he told her to turn right after the train crossing ahead. She pulled up to the crossing, stopped, looked both ways for a train, and then turned right onto the train tracks. My friend frantically told her to stop the car and get out immediately. She did, and he jumped into the driver's seat and put the car into reverse. Right after he pulled the car away from the tracks, the crossing gate came down and a train passed. Needless to say, she did not pass. Story 2. This was the event that actually ended his career and forced him to retire. He was testing a young woman who was very nervous and shaky the whole time. She made little mistakes here and there, swerving, not checking mirrors, not fully stopping. At that point, he decided she was not going to pass and asked her to return to the office. On the way back, they drove through a construction zone on a bridge where one lane was closed and concrete barricades narrowed the road. The woman was shaking and, through a combination of nerves, inexperience, and bad luck, she slammed the accelerator instead of the brake. The car veered over the shoulder of the bridge into a work area and collided with the rear of a massive backhoe. The bucket of the machine came through the windshield and struck my friend's head. He was in a coma for 2 days, broke his neck and shoulder, suffered mild permanent brain damage, and now has post-traumatic stress disorder and will not be in a car when he is not driving. Thankfully, the woman was unscathed. My friend says he has never been the same. He is not as sharp and everything seems to take more effort now. He won a large settlement and received his pension early since he was close to retirement, so he retired then and now lives comfortably. Story 83. I am not a tester, but a friend recently had this experience. I drove him on the route I had taken at that Department of Motor Vehicles and the route my sister-in-law had taken there. In return, my friend showed my buddy all 3 routes before his license test. All 3 went through the park and were very similar with only one side street difference, so he assumed the test would go through the park. Without the examiner saying anything, he entered the park without using his turn signal and did not slow down. On the main road, the speed limit is 35 miles per hour. Then it drops to 25 miles per hour. It is a busy road with many signs, so you can easily miss the 25. When you enter the park, the speed limit is 15 miles per hour. It is uphill, which makes it tempting to go faster. In the end, he failed because of his reversing maneuver. The examiner did not note the park issue. He just laughed and said we were funny for taking him on the same routes we had used. It turned out to be the same examiner who tested me. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.